Now it gives me great pleasure to introduce our morning keynote speaker, Bill Stowe. He is CEO and General Manager of the Des Moines Waterworks. Des Moines Waterworks, as you know, is a regional utility that provides public health and promotes economic development by delivering outstanding quality water, affordable and in reliable quantities. The Des Moines Waterworks works very closely with business, environmental, consumer, and agricultural leaders to advocate for better stewardship of water resources and clean water initiatives throughout central Iowa. So with that, Bill Stowe.
Good morning, everyone. Take a minute and stand up. Most of you have been seated for almost 2 hours, I think. Please stretch a little bit. While you're stretching, I'm going to make a few comments off my normal presentation. It's great to be back in Iowa City. I had the pleasure of living in Iowa City for several years, where I was responsible for Mid-American's operations here on Lower Muscatine Road, for those of you who know Iowa City. I went to school in Madison and in Champaign and grew up in the Ames area, but I always felt welcomed in Iowa City, and it was great to be back last night, both to hear Mark downtown, but also to slip over to Prairie Lights and to slip over to the Sanctuary and even make it to the Dublin Underground, so some of my favorite haunts. Iowa City is a special place in my life, and I look at Iowa City as its own mecca. And I have to thank Pete, the Public Policy Center, the University of Iowa, for again hosting an extraordinary symposium today. It's a pleasure to be part of the agenda, part of the program, and to hear from the professional community that we're all part of. It's an honor to be here. I also have to say how much and how highly I regard the University of Iowa as a leader in the public discourse on very controversial issues. I believe that they are the leader in the academic community in this state in talking about issues that in other institutions, other state institutions, would be less favorably supported. So I truly appreciate that. The University of Iowa is a leader in my heart, and I believe a leader in our community throughout the state. Great to be here. A number of issues have been touched on today that I'm going to touch on. Jerry, I also have to say, as somebody who listens to the Iowa Environmental Minute every week, hearing your voice up here, I feel almost, I don't know, called in a church to follow you. So thank you for your great work and great voice in bringing a tremendous message to Iowans. Great voice and great content. Appreciate it. Speaking of great voice and great content, let's see if I can make a video work here. Oh my God, it's an apple. This is going to kill me. Let's see if I can actually figure out how to operate a technology that I've rejected for my entire life. How about if I hit...
I'm down 58%.
Bill, that's fantastic.
Iowa farmers are celebrating the decline of nutrients in surface water. Their ongoing voluntary efforts like no-till, terracing, and contour farming have made Iowa's waterways cleaner.
Here's to losing more.
Iowa farmers doing their part to make a difference.
Wow, my thanks to the Farm Bureau for their own creative writing. In a community that supports the Writers' Workshop, I love these kinds of advertisements because, of course, there are some nuggets of things that I have great appreciation for, like no-till and low-till. But the idea that our farming community is seated in small communities, carefully tracking their nitrate contributions to our water sources, to me, is incredulous. There we go. I'm going to get this. Thank you, Larry, for your pop instruction on Apple. Woo. Let's try this. There we go. I'm going to talk about regulation in agricultural watersheds, which means regulation in Iowa watersheds for those of us who certainly appreciate the contribution of agriculture both positively and negatively to our state. This picture is an area just to the north of Des Moines where a harmful algal plume, HAB in our trade, appeared in 2013. This same kind of algal bloom is the type of algal bloom that cut off the city of Toledo's water supply, a city very similar to our service area, about 500,000 people on the Lake Erie watershed in 2013. Not exactly the focus of a lot of discussion we've had recently on nitrate and nitrogen as opposed to phosphorus, but I think you get the idea. That is hardly what a watershed should contribute to a community. A lot of discussion about the importance of sustainability, the importance of water. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide with this group. Often when I'm talking with the community that I work for, the 500,000 folks in central Iowa, I'll spend more time on this. But water is an extraordinarily precious resource. And although you've heard a lot about the hydrologic cycle, and I'll talk a little bit about it, it's a resource that we tend to disregard. Most of water, obviously, is salt water. The fresh water is largely entrapped, even with global warming and ice. And the very precious commodity that we have in readily fluid water that's potable, at least in theory, is often despoiled by our own efforts. These are the watersheds that are of most interest to me in my business, and I do head a business, not an environmental group. I am responsible in working and privileged to work with 120 or so folks to deliver water. I'll tell you a little bit about our business, but these are the source waters that we rely on. We are not groundwater providers, we're surface water providers, and the watersheds that we draw water from are primarily the Raccoon watershed, but also secondarily the Des Moines watershed, both of which intersect in Des Moines. Roughly 10,000 square miles of land drains to us. And of course, I'm confident that you know that that's overwhelmingly agricultural and land use upstream from us. This really is our service territory. Although we're called Des Moines Waterworks, that's more a historic issue than it is an actual issue today. I work for 5 trustees who were appointed by the mayor of Des Moines, but the majority of the customers that I serve are not residents of Des Moines. We serve 500,000 people in 4 counties, Polk, which I'm sure all of you are familiar with, Dallas to our west, but 2 to our south. They're heavily rural, incidentally, and increasingly suburbanizing. That's both Warren and Madison counties. We produce water and sell it by wholesale to Warren Water, and then to a familiar term to, or a familiar name to several of you probably in central Iowa and in northern Iowa, Xenia Water District, which serves largely to our west in a fastly growing area of Dallas County in particular, and a bit in Madison County to our south. But we have obviously a mixture of very urbanized, by Iowa standards at least, customers, a lot of suburban customers. The majority of the customers that I serve are suburban, not within the city of Des Moines, and a fair amount, probably of our 500,000 or so, I would say 30 or 40,000, shrinking number, of rural residents. So we certainly understand that part of our customer base also. We'll talk just briefly about the business of how we produce water. I mentioned that we're surface water providers. We draw from the Des Moines Raccoon River. We have 3 water treatment plants that rely on a technology that's 150 plus years old, lime softening. Lime softening introduces lime, which is a great anti-pathogenic treatment. It kills bacteria, kills viruses, kills parasites. It doesn't do very well with things like nitrate concentrations. We have to have a side stream treatment when we approach a threshold that we're very concerned about. And you heard the number earlier, 10 parts per million is a concern for us as a safe drinking water provider, and we have to turn on a whole different system. We have, however, one reverse osmosis ultra high filtration facility up near Ankeny, if you know Polk County. That's to our north between Des Moines and between Ames. It's a smaller plant, and that technology is very expensive, a factor of 2 times more generally in treating drinking water than our traditional lime softening. So we do not rely on it unless we absolutely have to, and realistically it's a small contributor to our overall water production. A day like today, even with light rain, not a lot of irrigation going on, obviously, will produce about 45 million gallons of water. If we were meeting in July, we would be producing and selling about 90 million gallons of water. We are obviously a summer peaking utility, much like our friends at Mid-American Electric, at least. Often, when I'm talking with my professional peers who are water producers, they cringe at the idea that I'm supporting a proposition of greater regulation of our source waters in particular, because we as an industry are highly regulated. We test for almost 90 different components in the water supply every day, and that's not only, as you might think, of water coming in and water as it's treated, but also a very serious concern for us is the quality of water after we put it into our distribution system. We have over 1,000 miles of distribution system, and disinfectant byproducts or carcinogens because of water age out in the system is a great concern to us when you have a system as large as ours with customers who may be by pipe 40 or 50 miles away from where the water is produced. Talked a little bit earlier in a number of different presentations about the hydrologic cycle. And I know that we all have a good sense of a cycle. It's change, but yet it's sameness. In water, obviously, every molecule of water that exists today was created at the same time. We recycle it, we reuse it, we defile it, but the same resource has to be available to us in a growing population and with growing needs. And just a side note on needs, you and I, as water consumers in our home or in our apartments or in our dormitories, whatever it may be, are far better consumers than our parents were or our grandparents were. We have low-flow toilets and smart appliances and shower heads that deliver less water to us as individual customers. But unfortunately, when it comes to the larger scheme of things, in our business in particular, in a metropolitan area, we see a great deal of irrigation going on and a great deal of reliance on plantings and ornamentals and preferences that draw water from potable water use for human consumption to other uses. Great business opportunity for us, but certainly the kinds of policy concerns that we're seeing coming out of California right now under Governor Brown's leadership, but in the western states generally, where there is a recognition that there is a misuse of water. I am a huge movie fan. This is my favorite movie of all time. Most people seen Citizen Kane? Excellent. You know, the demographic on that is fascinating to me. You know, my son, who's a college student, was forced to see it from birth, actually pre-birth, in my household. But a lot of his friends have no idea what Citizen Kane is. If you haven't seen Citizen Kane, you know, spend $1 to go rent it if you can find it in the library and pick it up for a weekend. The reason I love Citizen Kane, among others, is the clarity of its message. For those of you who have seen it, if I say Rosebud, you know what I mean, right? It has such extraordinary clarity. If you've seen the movie, that idea of clarity, of artistic clarity, is a concept that I believe very fervently needs to be part of our communication process and our view on science, particularly on environmental issues involving water. Let me see if I can click through a couple reminders for those of you who may not have seen this for a while. Orson Welles holding the snow globe at the end of the movie. Love the visuals. It rolls out of his hand. Oh, close your eyes if you haven't seen the movie. There would be Rosebud. And that doesn't tell you a lot if you haven't seen it. But Rosebud, if you have seen it and know what that sled means in the context of the movie, is an extraordinarily emotive, communicative process, I think, for those of us who love the movie or those who may have just seen it in passing. It's an extraordinary movie. Look at it. Now, why would I be up here talking about Citizen Kane, besides being able to share with you that I love Orson Welles? Land use is the concept that I'm going to talk about today in the context of water quality. Here's the American myth of farming, the family farm. That looks like what Bob Evans farms in Ohio as an example. I feel like I should kind of put my SUV into the parking lot and get a cinnamon roll and some coffee. Not exactly the reality of farming as I would see it today versus the myth. There are only about 90,000 of these so-called family farms. The idea that we feed the world is a myth. I think you heard that to some degree in Mark's comments last night. Great speech, great lecture and presentation here. We as Iowans import roughly 90% of our food. A lot of discussion about local food in Iowa City and Johnson County, obviously a leader in that regard, but the idea that we are feeding the world, to me, is a myth. And a myth always has its value, but it always has its disvalue. I think we need to look beyond that. This is the industrial agriculture that I'm familiar with, at least as a business person who receives its source water at the foot of industrial agriculture. We see a nice herder cooling his feet in the water, something that isn't allowed in some of our neighboring states. The idea of having livestock in the water is viewed negatively as it should be by some of our neighbors. And I love the sprayer here, right at the edge of the waterway. I'm told, although I haven't seen it, obviously some people spray right over the waterway if they need to. Huge concern to us, obviously, when it's coming down straight through the waterway to us. Here is a map that is not as communicative, probably the lighting here as it should be, but it supports what you know. 90% of the land in the state is agricultural. The watersheds that I have responsibility for taking source water clean for 500,000 folks is overwhelmingly in crops. Intensive row crop farming, corn and soybean, often corn on corn on corn. To our north, with drainage practices we'll talk about a little bit coming to us, and again about 10,000 square miles north of Des Moines. The Des Moines River actually originates as something probably in southern Minnesota. The Raccoon River, wholly an interstate waterway, is our primary waterway to rely upon for a lot of technical reasons, not the least of which is we just open up our gates and our plants to get it. For the most part, we have to pump it, unlike the Moines River water we can pump across town. Also pretty important when we talk about land use, the Citizen King contorted theme here, to look at land use involving CAFOs, animal feeding operations in our watershed. Look at the intensity of animal feeding operation within the Raccoon River waterways. Certainly, it's also very intense further to the north and to the west in Missouri waterways, Sioux County, Plymouth County, that area, but extraordinarily intense also just north of the Des Moines area. Hamilton, Hardin counties as an example, just to our north of Ames. Extraordinary contributors in our view water quality impacts downstream of the Des Moines metro area. These are the concerns, and you're all going to be pretty familiar with most of them, that we have as surface water producers. Nitrates, nitrogen generally, and nutrients generally, nitrates, phosphorus, and ammonia. I've heard some discussion about it. Focus on nitrates because realistically, phosphorus generally is something that travels with the soil, and our friends who are the agronomists from Iowa State, and a number of whom are here, can certainly talk about that in great detail. But our processing, this lime softening that we use, does a pretty good job of taking that turbidity, taking those suspended solids, taking that soil out of the water. Where we have far more difficulty is in nitrates, where we have to use a side stream process that is not part of our normal treatment process. It's both expensive and it's destructive in its own environmental ways. Obviously, Iowa water has its own significant concerns on a number of microbials that we've talked about, bacteria, protozoa, viruses. We have an occasional concern about spills. We're a surface water provider. We're not taking groundwater. We believe that we are a sustainable water producer. Obviously, the aquifers in this state and nationally are being depleted far more quickly than they're being recharged. We believe that surface water obviously is a sustainable use, but there are other factors other than agriculture in the short term in particular that can affect us. If we have a spill from a tanker crossing either Des Moines or Raccoon River, now some very specific discussion of, as an example, oil pipelines that would traverse our state and create risks at river crossings for us. We're able to switch between rivers pretty flawlessly, not inexpensively, but we're able to do that. We're very fortunate we have two water sources in the Des Moines and Raccoon. It would be very unusual to have significant spills on both of those rivers at the same time. Some other things that are of significant concern to us, just point out TTHM, total trihallomethanes. That's a disinfectant byproduct, a carcinogen. When we have a lot of ammonia from animal or human waste, but largely it's from animal waste, coming into our water system, we have to disinfect at high levels. That creates the risk of cancer to our users because that disinfectant byproduct from the use of chlorine ultimately breaks down in our system, particularly in the more distant parts of our system where the water ages and creates health risks. We violated this area of the the Safe Drinking Water Act last year, have to notify our customers, have to spend a lot of time explaining what it is. As you can imagine, even saying total trihallomethanes is a challenge, and for our consumers, 500,000 to understand the very nominal risk from something like that carcinogen versus the concerns that they would have if we did not chlorinate, and the disinfectant concerns there are a challenge to be able to communicate effectively publicly. One thing I'll talk about, because I'm confident you'll hear more about it, are emerging contaminants like endocrine disruptors. I stand up here talking with you today, taking a number of pharmaceuticals for a number of years on things like cholesterol and high blood pressure. Obviously, that's going through my system and through a wastewater treatment plant that really is not focused on that kind of treatment into the water supply. I've used me and humans as an example because that seems to be where most of our discussion is about superbugs and about drugs going through the system into the water supply. Imagine the scale of difference for your consideration between 3 million Iowans and 20 million Iowa hogs, and how drugs are used regularly in the feeding regime to create growth and to reduce risk of exposure before it's ever shown in animal health. I'm going to talk about nitrates because it is certainly the topic du jour, if that's the right expression, in my business in central Iowa. Nitrates, again, and you've heard a little bit about nitrates already this morning, NO3, are a huge concern to us, not because most of the people in this room are a risk category within that risk group. Generally, it's infants 6 months and under. But as a water supplier, when we tell our customers that we have violated the Safe Drinking Water Act, that is the regulation that is closest to our hearts, those customers hear that the water is unsafe in every possible way. They think it's a carcinogen. They think it's a health risk to the old, to the young, to themselves, maybe a pathogen in their own mind. It's very difficult to say, we've violated a federal regulation, but the water really is safe. We don't do that. They wouldn't hear it if we did. It's a challenge to be able to face that from a business standpoint. We are a business again. We are in business to sell water. We believe that safe, affordable, abundant drinking water is a human right. And it is extraordinarily important for us for economic development reasons, among others, to be able to deliver that in demanded quantities for 500,000 folks. And realistically, like this area of the state, one of the few areas in Iowa that are growing and developing. Let me talk about Gulf hypoxia just for a moment, because I think there was a great point made that there's been a lot of discussion and a lot of focus on Louisiana, and the Gulf Coast is really the brunt of industrial agriculture or water quality concerns in Iowa. Obviously, we are trying in our business and particularly Des Moines Waterworks, to focus that more closely into central Iowa. As somebody who lived in New Orleans for a number of years, I'll tell you that most Louisianians, unless they're in the shrimping industry, and actually way down in Louisiana to be able to have that appreciation, don't think of Gulf Coast hypoxia as a real and present danger for their lives. I will tell you that the nitrate concentration concerns that we have is a real and present danger for our business. Be that as it may, federal attention on hypoxia brought together a group of state leaders, particularly in the northern Mississippi watersheds, but throughout the watershed, and said, what are you going to do to be able to address nutrient pollution in the Gulf? Happened several years ago, actually, the late 1990s, and certainly going to present day. Bill Northey, Secretary of Agriculture for Iowa, has certainly been heavily involved in that. A number of people, I'm confident, in this room were involved in what's called the nutrient reduction strategy. Let's talk about that for a moment. The nutrient reduction strategy is Iowa's answer to Gulf Coast hypoxia concerns. As a matter of science, we think it is a great white paper, a great source of science on nutrient pollution in the Gulf. That is, 90% of it is from unregulated sources like agriculture. 10% is from heavily regulated sources like industrial producers, wastewater treatment plants. All that we perfectly agree with. The problem is when you go from that science to policy, we see a real breakdown, because the basic policy premise of the Iowa nutrient reduction strategy is regulate more, the 10%, and leave unregulated or encourage voluntary conservation practices for the 90%. And somehow with that policy, we wonder why we're not making inroads in water quality in this state. I think it's pretty obvious that if you let 90% of it run on voluntarism and the good faith and good wishes of a majority of folks and heavily regulate the 10%, you're not going to make very real progress towards improved water quality. There are a number of things that the nutrient reduction strategy also puts out as policy, that they want to reduce nitrate pollution into the Gulf by about 45%. No measurements, no objectives, no goals, no time frame. I will tell you that I'm going to lose 45% of my weight someday. I may not be alive, but it'll happen. The idea that you can set those kind of aspirations without specific tie-downs, particularly when it involves a public health issue, to us is ridiculous public policy. And we believe contrary to federal and state law. Let me show you some numbers here that I know histograms are often a little busy, but here are some numbers from 1995 forward. Anything above the origin, anything above the axis here, is a potential violation of the Safe Drinking Water Act for us. These are times in either the Des Moines or Raccoon River, and often in both, where the raw water that we're receiving in the rivers is above 10 milligrams per liter. Obviously, this is a problem for us. And as you look at 2014 as an example, you'll see a number of days, actually about 80 it looks like, if my eyesight is working, on the Des Moines River, about 135 or so on the Raccoon River, where those requirements could not be made, and often they're on the same days, as you can imagine. You'll see, interestingly enough, and the Farm Bureau certainly loves these kind of numbers, it helps their trend data analysis, 2008 through 2012, where the nitrate concentrations are very low, at least seemingly low. Why is that? Those are flood years. So you have this huge volume of water diluting what's coming off into the base flow. But I'll tell you, the concentration, the loadings, going into the Gulf are extraordinarily high. That are delivered are extraordinarily high. I'm getting the 5 minutes on. Wow. Okay, thank you. Very, very subtle. Very subtle. Let me talk about the nutrient reduction strategy graphically again for just a second. The nutrient reduction strategy was announced after years of work in 2013. And again, there's on the policy side, there's a sense that it's this a silver bullet, that it's a miracle, that there are new practices and science-based philosophy there that will turn it around. This is what's happened since its announcement in my business. Very similar, except the histogram here is a more longitudinal data focused in the time period from when it was announced to now. Anything above the red line is a huge problem. The summer of 2013, we saw after the nutrient reduction strategy was announced, we saw the worst numbers we've ever seen on both the Des Moines and raccoon at the same time. 20 on the raccoon, 25 on the raccoon, 20 on the Des Moines. Late last year and into this year, we had to run our denitrification facilities for 96 consecutive days from December 6th through St. Patrick's Day, through mid-March, in the winter. Very unusual for us, and a harbinger in our view of a larger concern about what's really going on upstream that seems to be off the ken of consideration for the nutrient reduction strategy voluntarism. These are our denitrification facilities. They are large facilities, which you can't tell by scale here, but they're 20 plus years old, and they're based on an ionization process that uses salt. Pulls, after we treat the water normally, pulls the nitrate away from the treated water into a salt slurry that we admittedly and embarrassingly return to the Raccoon River. Because breaking the nitrogen cycle in what's a very complicated discussion to have is not easy. We're not creating it. We're stuck, unfortunately, with having to deal with it in the water sources that we have in an aging technology. To replace that technology, which will have to be replaced if we have to continue to run it in the kind of cycles we're seeing now, we're again approaching 10 today, as an example, on the Des Moines River and the Raccoon River. These are operating costs. Generally, and this is where the Farm Bureau says, oh, it costs your customers $1 per, 20-year period or whatever you want to regularize it to. The real issue is the capital cost at the bottom. To replace it is 75 to twice that amount to be able to replace it with current technologies. It's a huge issue for a water utility where in the Des Moines area in particular, we have social and economic justice issues we are dealing with. 70% of my customers in the city of Des Moines send their kids to public schools who get subsidized lunches. I've got some very affluent customers, some in Des Moines, but a lot in the suburbs, a little bit different economic and social justice issue, but asking my customers to pay for this, to me, is a significant business issue for us. I need to finish up very quickly, so here is the HAB again, phosphorus related, just to our north. We can have algal problems, very real in the Raccoon River in particular, not as real as it is for our brothers and sisters who take water, drinking water, surface water away from still waters like Lake Erie as an example. But I'm often asked this question, why is Des Moines so unique in their concerns about nitrate? This is a drainage district map across the United States. You'll see where the darker it is, the more intensely drained the watersheds are through drainage districts. You'll see 3 hot spots in the United States. Des Moines, Iowa, that's where I'm from. Champaign, Illinois, that's where I used to live. They take their water from groundwater sources. And Toledo, Ohio, or the Lake Erie Basin, the western portion of the Lake Erie Basin, where the water does not go to the Mississippi River, it goes through drainage tiling systems to Lake Erie, causing significant problems for particularly commercial fishermen in the tourist industry that, surprisingly enough, is very big in northern Ohio. These are where drainage districts are in Iowa. You're not going to see many in your watershed out here. Not going to see many in any other watersheds except the ones that unfortunately drain to Des Moines and the Des Moines area. Drainage districts are quasi-governmental entities overseen by boards of supervisors that have independent taxing authority and construct things like this. This is probably actually on private property, bringing more water into the watershed artificially. But here's a good example of the public and private working together. The blue lines are essentially the private grid system on individual farms. They come into a public system that are again supervised. They're constructed, operated, and maintained by boards of supervisors that mainline water quickly we believe, groundwater into the surface waters of the state that we rely on for drinking water. And for those of you who think we have natural hydrology in this state, there's a great picture of beautiful Sac County, one of the contributors of source waters into the Raccoon River that's of some topicality to me. Ultimately, this is a policy question that we ask. Why should agriculture not be regulated as a point source polluter? Why should the pipe on the left be regulated? The pipe on the right is not. We believe they're both point source polluters. We believe there should be agricultural accountability in this state for water quality. When 90% of the nutrient problem is caused by an unregulated source and we continue to have poor results, we need to regulate that 90%. There are great conservation practices. Sean will talk. I'm confident about that at noon. There are a number of them that are out there. They're just being thinly used. And if you hear the phrase that there's an exponential increase in cover crops as an example, when the base number is 1, that exponent has to be really high for that to make any difference. Tragedy of the Commons, I'm confident you all have an appreciation for this idea that us as individuals acting on our own behalf don't necessarily lead to a rational outcome for our community. The author of this kind of thought process said the real tragedy was of the unregulated commons. Mark Dayton, to our north, the governor of Minnesota, recently said this in the context of buffer strips around waterways. The land might be yours, but the water belongs to all of us. That's the kind of thinking that we're not seeing from our political leadership in this state. Whether you're a Democrat or Republican, neither party are stepping up on this issue in a way that we would want to see. Clearly, that's one of the policy nerves that we're hitting as we talk to the public and do other things. Regulation has become such a horrible word to us. We live in this, kind of Nirvana Ayn Rand society where we think we should all be libertarians, but yet we're communal. I know when I take my antihypertensive drugs in the morning, I'm glad that my pharmacist is licensed. I'm glad when I fly in and out of Des Moines and go to LA as an example, I'm glad there's regulation for air traffic control. The free market does not excite me when I eat food publicly. We have regulation to support and protect public health. Can we have better regulations? Obviously, but the idea that no regulation and voluntarism will provide us adequate protection for our public health, to me, is ridiculous and flies contrary to all of our experience in environmental protection. I think that I have more than exhausted the time that I have supposed to use. I'm going to put some bumper stickers on the back table for those of you who are bumper sticker people. Clean water is for life. It's an important principle in our discussion with the public. Always a pleasure to be here today. I don't know, Larry, if you want to take a few questions or how we want to handle that. Before you waste your time writing out a question that asks me about the current litigation, don't. I'm a lawyer in the state of Iowa. I am prohibited for a number of reasons by my license to not comment publicly on litigation I'm actively involved in. So I can talk in general terms, and I have talked in general terms about drainage districts and about point source pollution, but that's about as specific as I'm going to get, so save your question for a better body block on me than that one.
So I'm not sure that we'll be able to answer everybody's question. We only have a few minutes, but we'll start with the first one, Bill, and that is, what agricultural practices, if generally adopted, do you feel would meet the goals of the nutrient reduction strategy?
What agricultural practices do I believe would move us toward nutrient reduction success? And ultimately, I'll tell you, our friends at Iowa State and the Nutrient Reduction Center certainly will have stronger science and a better appreciation for specifics that they can talk about. We've talked about and saw on the slide, obviously rotation is their infield and edge of field issues that are going to be important. At the end of the day, I don't care, so long as the source water that I'm drawing from is workable for us to be able to treat in a way and affordable to deliver to our customers. We hear all the time from the Farm Bureau, regulation is one size fits all. Well, what I'm concerned about is what the quality is of that pipe effluent coming into the river. What happens upstream from that, I will certainly concede, is a better province for the drainage district or for the farmers who are involved in it. There are a number of tools out there that I think that they should be using. One of the great concerns I have about the farm community, the industrial agricultural leadership, I should be more specific in this state, is there's no specific condemnation of practices that should be condemned. Fall application is one that raises huge concerns for us. The fact that we are seeing huge nitrate concentrations in the winter, we believe a significant contributor to that is fall applications. Why the leadership has not stepped up to condemn that or to suggest that that is a poor management practice, to me, is another indication that regulation is going to be necessary to move us forward.
Second question is, how do we get more Iowans engaged in the political discourse about nutrients and nutrition?
The question is, how should we collectively work with our communities to get more folks engaged in this kind of discussion? I think it's a huge embarrassment that in any of our political debates, we don't even hear about environmental policy in Iowa. If we were in California, if we were in Wisconsin, if we were in Minnesota, if we were in Connecticut, those would be issues that our policymakers would be talking about because we as voters make them talk about that. I would encourage you, through groups like each of yours, through your discussion with state legislators, through your discussion even with council people in progressive cities like Coralville and Iowa City and North Liberty, to talk about environmental issues and water quality issues. We believe that our strategy of talking with the public, like you, and these kinds of discussions, as well as using legal resources that we believe are available to us, is the only way that we are going to shock this system to move forward to better environmental protection. Because the policymakers and the status quo in this state is anti-environmental at best.
We spend about $100 billion in the U.S. to clean up point sources under the Clean Water Act. How much money will it take to incentivize farmers to clean up?
Wow. The question is, we spend about $100 billion on point source cleanup, that is pipe cleanup for those that are regulated. What would it cost to incent farmers to be able to meaningfully engage in environmental protection? I don't claim to have a good answer to that, but I think that the appropriate answer is somebody with an economics background is whatever it's going to take. The problem now is in Iowa, we spent in 2011, I believe, $1.4 billion on farm subsidies, haven't directly tied that to conservation practices. We're wasting our money and we're sending a mixed signal. What it will really take, ultimately, I don't know, but it has to happen because at some point we have to realize that the environmental asset here really is priceless. We're not talking about, Prada shoes or even Beethoven. We're talking about water. This is what you and I need to live on. Thanks, Larry. Thank you very much. Thanks very much.
Thanks.